Human woman stranded on an alien planet discovers she's carrying an alien's child. Captain Mira Lang could not recall a time she had been so deeply rattled by silence as she was in that single, suspended moment before the starship Eclipse finally tore itself to pieces. Alarms had shrieked, metal had groaned, and warning lights had blinked furiously across the shattered consoles. But beneath it all was a kind of ringing hush in her ears, as though time itself refused to flow. She remembered grasping for the throttle, trying to steer the wounded craft to a level patch of ground on that bleak planet below. Then came the final crunch of impact, a sound that hammered against her skull with terrifying clarity. Yet as soon as the Eclipse slammed into the rocky surface of Vedra 6, the illusions of control dissolved, leaving her tossed like a rag doll amid the carnage of twisted metal and flickering overhead lights. When she finally regained consciousness, she found that the only sounds were distant pops of electricity, the faint hiss of leaking coolant, and the hiss of her own labored breaths. In that instant, Captain Mira Lang, the pride of her Earth-based academy, the resolute leader of exploratory missions, felt more terrified than she had ever been in her 31 years. She fought her way free of the collapsed command console, crawling over the half-fused panels and severed harness straps. The stench of melted insulation and the pungent tang of burning fuel threatened to overwhelm her, but adrenaline kept her wits keen. Her side throbbed painfully, and every breath was an ordeal, yet she had a singular, urgent need to check for survivors. The Eclipse had carried a crew of 15, humans and aliens alike, each member essential to the grand mission of charting uncharted space beyond the known frontier. They had answered the call of cosmic wonder, but now, battered and alone, Mira's only aim was to gauge the extent of this catastrophe. She clung to a battered corridor railing and steadied herself, listening. Someone, or something, was alive among the wreckage, and she was determined to find them before the planet's harsh environment claimed them all. A sputtering overhead light revealed that the corridor bulkheads had buckled. Twisted shards of metal protruded like razors. Sparks danced on the floor, leaping into the gloom. It was the central hallway leading from the bridge to the science lab, and it was hardly recognizable. With trembling hands, Mira reached for a portable scanner that lay half-buried beneath a broken crate of med supplies. Through the flickering readout, she saw faint life signs somewhere ahead. She hurried, every step jarring her bruised ribs. She knew oxygen reserves would be limited. The hull must have ruptured in dozens of places, letting the planet's meager atmosphere seep in. She tasted dryness in the air, a dusty bitterness that clung to her tongue. Just beyond the corridor, in what remained of the scientific lab, she found her chief xenobiologist, Dr. Esteban. He lay crumpled against a toppled equipment shelf, but one glance was enough to tell her that life had already abandoned his eyes. She bowed her head, grief threatening to overwhelm her, but there was no time to mourn properly. The scanner showed another life sign flickering close by, stronger than the rest, and she clung to that hope like a lifeline. She picked her way through the wreckage until she reached an open door leading into an auxiliary chamber. The sign overhead read Navigation Center, though half the letters had been scorched away. Inside, pinned beneath a fallen beam, was Ralvek, her alien navigator. Ralvek was a Vashai, tall and slender, with skin the shade of indigo under normal lighting. Though the artificial lights now sparked and flickered, she could see the faint sheen of his sweat, or the alien equivalent, covering his face. "Captain," Ralvek's voice came weakly. Mira lunged forward, ignoring the stabbing pain in her side, and together they wrestled to lift the heavy beam from his pinned legs. The Vashai's features were elegantly angular, his wide black eyes reflecting worry and a tinge of embarrassment that he, a proud navigator from the outer colonies, required rescuing by a human. But relief washed over Mira when the last of the beam gave way, and she managed to pull him free. "How bad?" she asked, voice raspy with lingering dust and smoke. "My left leg, possibly fractured," he managed, gritting his teeth in pain. "Our crash was abrupt." Mira almost laughed at the understatement. The crash had been violent beyond anything she had ever imagined. "We need to find medkits, emergency supplies. If the ship's hull is too compromised, we'll have to move outside." She helped Ralvek to his feet, supporting his weight against her shoulder. The unexpected closeness struck her, She had rarely been this physically close to him, though they had been colleagues for over a year. Vashai generally kept to themselves, often finding human mannerisms awkward. Ralvek, especially, had seemed so unflappable and aloof that Mira had assumed little could rattle him. Yet here he was, trembling in pain, leaning on her for support. Swallowing hard, she coaxed him to hobble along as they made their way through the ruined corridors. The flickering of emergency lighting cast bizarre shadows, making the ship's interior appear haunted. Doors that had once opened smoothly now stood jammed or twisted shut. The corridor reeked of burnt plastic and the acrid tang of scorched wiring. Near the central hub, they found the remains of the cryolab. Inside were 3 cots with medical stasis fields. One had collapsed entirely, while another flickered uncertainly, a web of cracks running through its container. The third, remarkably, still functioned. This was good news. It meant the ship's emergency systems might not be entirely lost. Mira eased Ralvek onto the stasis cot so that she could examine his injury. Her own knowledge of xenophysiology was rudimentary at best, just enough to get by in an emergency. Normally, Dr. Esteban or one of the other specialists would have handled a wounded Vashai. Now there was no one left to help, at least none that she could find alive. Silently, she activated the stasis field. Immediately, a gentle hum surrounded Ralvek's lower body, working to stabilize the fracture and numb the worst of the pain. He exhaled in relief. "Thank you, Captain. We're in this together," she replied gently, trying to banish the tightness in her throat. She opened a wall panel and discovered a few intact rations, an emergency medkit, and the remains of a communicator. The device gave a half-hearted beep but refused to establish contact with anything beyond the ruined interior of the Eclipse. Kneeling, she rummaged deeper, extracting a battered data slate that might still hold star charts and environmental analysis. With it, she could perhaps glean what Vedra Six's atmosphere might contain. She spared one more look at Ralvek. Despite the stasis field, he was pale, paler than usual for a Vashai, and exhaustion lined the delicate ridges around his eyes. "The Eclipse is unsalvageable," Mira announced, feeling a burst of anger at her own words. "We'll be forced to set up a makeshift camp outside. This environment is harsh, but there's a chance we can survive if we find shelter." Ralvek nodded, swallowing. "From the scans I ran while we were descending, there should be subterranean structures, perhaps natural caverns." There was no time to confirm, but his words dissolved into a fit of coughing. Mira quickly gave him a sip from the emergency water flask she had salvaged. The dryness of the planet's air was evidently harsh even on a Vashai's physiology, and she felt the same roughness scratch her own throat. "I'll get you stabilized, then we'll gather what we can," she said. "Let's see if the sensors can tell us where these caverns might be." She carefully propped Ralvek against a chunk of fallen hull plating. Outside the fractured ship, the dull red glow of Vedra Six's star cast the horizon in a stark, otherworldly light. Through a jagged tear in the hull, she caught sight of pale dust swirling across the rocky wasteland. This was not a planet known for hospitality. The original mission log stated it was largely uninhabitable, with precariously thin air and extreme temperature fluctuations. As she attempted to parse the battered data slate, she felt Ralvek's presence close behind her. He hovered with a stoic sort of dignity, keeping pressure off his wounded leg. "It must be near dawn," he said quietly. "Vedra Six's days are short, if I recall. We may have only a few hours until the sun sets again and the temperature drops significantly." She grimaced. "Then we move quickly. We can't stay here. If the hull is compromised, we'll lose any breathable air soon." They spent the next hour scavenging every corner of the starship that remained accessible. Mira was forced to look upon the still forms of her fallen crewmates, each discovery a fresh pang of sorrow. She wished she had time to bury them properly, to mourn in the tradition of Earth. But this was a matter of survival, and Vedra Six afforded no opportunity for gentle rites. Among the compartments they searched was a storage bay containing rations sealed in vacuum packs, portable oxygen canisters, and a single functioning water condenser, battered but still operational. The water condenser was a precious miracle. Without it, they would have been dependent on the dryness of the planet's environment, which seemed to lack surface water entirely. The day pressed on, and with each salvaged item, Mira felt a mixture of triumph and deeper despair. There would be no second chance if they failed to gather enough. The data slate indicated potential cave systems some 12 kilometers to the north. It was a daunting trek, especially in Ralvek's injured condition. At last, arms laden with supplies, they exited the ruined starship. The light was wan, more orange than red now, painting the broken hull of the Eclipse in a color reminiscent of rust. The craft's proud insignia was half buried beneath rubble and dust. Mira forced herself not to dwell on it. Survival demanded forward motion, not sentiment. "Captain," Ralvek said, voice still hushed. "Shall we?" She nodded, meeting his gaze. Something in his black eyes mirrored her determination, as well as her fear. They were both at the mercy of this planet now, whether they liked it or not. In the thin daylight, the landscape stretched before them in a drab panorama of stone and dust. Wind-sculpted cliffs rose like ancient monoliths, their jagged edges testifying to the planet's harsh weather patterns. The ground underfoot was loose gravel mixed with a coarse, rust-colored sand that puffed with each footstep. Mira set a slow pace, mindful of Ralvek's injury and her own bruised ribs. Each step sent a jolt of pain through her side, but she bit back any complaint. There was no alternative. They had to keep moving if they wanted to reach the caves before nightfall. Throughout their journey, the sun's heat bore down mercilessly. Though it was not as stifling as on some planets, the dryness exacerbated every breath. Mira found herself rationing sips of water from the condenser, conscious that any miscalculation now could leave them parched before they found shelter. At intervals, she glanced at Ralvek. His jaw was set, sweat or its alien equivalent shimmering across his brow. She wondered what the Vashai core body temperature was, or whether he was at risk of heat stroke. As if he sensed her scrutiny, he offered a faint nod. "I will endure," he said. "Though, I admit, the dryness is somewhat oppressive." Mira managed a small smile. "If you faint, I'm not sure I can carry you far." "That would be unfortunate," he replied, the corners of his eyes softening. In that moment, a flicker of amusement passed between them, a tiny ember in the vast cold of the unknown. By the time they neared the entrance to the first of the rock formations that might contain caves, the sun had dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the terrain. The temperature began to plummet swiftly, an abrupt reminder of how little atmosphere there was to buffer day from night. Mira pulled out a scanning device they had salvaged. The device beeped faintly, indicating a hollow region beneath the ridge. They circled a bulging rock face until at last they found a narrow fissure leading inward. Her heart quickened. If the interior of these caves was stable, if there was any natural warmth or humidity, they might stand a chance of surviving. The fissure was tight, barely enough for them to slip through with their supplies. Mira squeezed sideways, scraping her shoulder against rough stone. Ralvek followed, wincing at the pain in his leg. Once inside, she activated a handheld lamp, revealing a sloping tunnel that vanished into darkness. The air felt cooler, but not frigid. If the day's heat had seeped in, it might remain at least moderately stable through the night. They ventured deeper, picking their way past jagged outcrops. The lamp's glow cast flickering shadows on the stone walls. The path soon opened into a spacious chamber with a ceiling lost in darkness. There was room enough for them to set down gear and begin to make a crude camp. Mira's breath caught. The echoes of their footsteps were the only sounds in that vaulted space. When she spoke, her voice came out hushed, as though she stood in a cathedral. "I think this will do," she murmured, lowering the supplies. "We'll need to check for any seismic activity or potential collapses, but it's out of the elements at least." Ralvek lowered himself carefully, grimacing as he braced his injured leg. "It is not ideal, but we do not have the luxury of choice. We'll survive here." Night fell in earnest outside the cave, and an eerie silence wrapped itself around them. Occasionally, a gust of wind whistled past the cave entrance, but no other life stirred. If there were indigenous creatures on Vedra 6, the crash site and immediate environs did not suggest their presence. Using what remained of the emergency flares, Mira set up a perimeter of faint light around the camp. Ralvek, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a piece of shattered hull plating, assisted where he could. Together, they assembled a thermal blanket near the cave wall, anchoring it with stones so it might reflect heat from a small heater they'd retrieved from the ship. Their meal was a silent affair, just ration packs and carefully conserved water. Mira could scarcely muster an appetite. The reality of their situation weighed upon her. 2 survivors, no guarantee of rescue, and limited supplies. She thought of the others who had lost their lives in the crash and felt her heart clench. At length, Ralvek spoke, his tone subdued. "Captain, how long do you estimate before the exploration board dispatches a search party?" She took a moment to answer. The Eclipse was on a relatively uncharted route. We were expected to check in every 4 days with a deep space relay. If the board notices our absence, they might send a search vessel. But that could be weeks, even months, given the distances involved and the uncertain nature of our flight path. Ralvek processed this, his features unreadable in the flickering gloom. "Then we must do all we can to survive until then." She nodded and placed a hand gently on his forearm. "Yes, we'll make it, Ralvek. We have to." Over the next few days, they labored to transform the cavern into a passable shelter. By day, when the punishing sun rose outside, they would venture a short distance to gather additional materials from the environment, smooth stones for a makeshift fireplace, or shards of crystalline rock that might serve as reflective surfaces for the lamp. The dryness of the air persisted, but the portable condenser proved reliable. Though the environment was harsh, Mira could not deny there was a strange, stark beauty to Vedra 6. The sky's tint shifted from deep vermilion at dawn to pale gold at midday, giving a perpetual sense of alien majesty. Strange rock spires lined the horizon, their shapes reminiscent of ancient castles. Sometimes, in the early morning, a faint breeze whirled through the cave mouth, carrying a fine, glittering dust that sparkled in the lamp's beam. Ralvek gradually regained some mobility. The stasis cot from the ship's med bay had helped stabilize the fracture. During daylight, he would practice walking outside the cave, leaning on the crutch while Mira stayed close in case he stumbled. Their companionship, born of necessity, deepened into a comfortable closeness that caught Mira by surprise. Where once she had seen a proud, distant navigator, she began to discover quiet empathy in Ralvek. He asked about her human upbringing, her time at the academy. In turn, he shared glimpses of his homeworld in the outer colonies. Vast jungles under pale turquoise skies, the Vashai city built on colossal, winding branches. It was a marvel to think that they had come from such different worlds, now united by fate on this desolate planet. Resilience became their shared mantra. Each morning, they dutifully checked the battered communicator, hoping by some miracle it might pick up a rescue signal. Each evening, they assessed their rations and made plans to stretch them longer. They tested the dryness of the outside air to see if any condensation might be harvested at night. So far, luck had been minimal. Mira still found it difficult to sleep, her mind haunted by images of the crash and the lost crew. She had a near-constant ache in her side, a bruise that refused to fade. Ralvek's presence, however, gave her a stabilizing anchor in this world of fear and uncertainty. Sometimes, before resting, they would share small stories, or simply watch the last rays of the red sun fade beyond the cave entrance. One dusk, while stirring the nutrient paste they had rehydrated for dinner, Mira felt a pang of homesickness. On Earth, her family would gather around a fireplace on cold evenings. She remembered warm laughter, stories told by an old uncle. Now, only the hollow hush of the cave accompanied her, with Ralvek's quiet footsteps shuffling nearby. He must have sensed her melancholy. "You miss your home," he said softly, sitting down next to her on a makeshift seat of stone. "Yes, I keep thinking about them, my father, my brothers. They'll be told I'm missing in action, or maybe they won't find out for months. I wish they knew I was alive." Ralvek's dark eyes glimmered in the lamplight. "In my culture, we believe that as long as a single living soul remembers you, your spirit echoes in the cosmic tapestry. They will remember you, Captain. You are not alone." She reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "You're right. And call me Mira. We're past ranks now." He hesitated, then nodded. "Mira." As the days stretched into weeks, a precarious routine settled in. The planet's daily cycle was relatively short, only about 18 hours. They slept in short intervals, rationing energy when the sun was at its zenith, venturing out during the gentler hours. They discovered a minor blessing in the form of small thermal vents deeper in the cave system, which provided a faint warmth and humidity. It was meager, but better than nothing. Mira noticed changes in her own body. At first, she dismissed the exhaustion as stress or the toll of survival in an alien environment. Yet soon, she felt bouts of nausea, particularly in the mornings, accompanied by a faint dizziness she could not quite explain. She examined herself for injuries or infection, but found none. She tried to hide it from Ralvek, unwilling to add to his concerns, but eventually, her trembling hands and ashen face betrayed her. He found her one morning at the cave entrance, leaning against the rock wall. "Mira," he asked softly, placing a cautious hand on her shoulder. "You seem unwell." She attempted a reassuring smile. "It's nothing, just fatigue." His expression darkened. "We cannot ignore signs of illness. The conditions here are harsh enough. Let me examine you." Though embarrassed, she relented. With the medscan module from the ship, Ralvek ran a basic test, analyzing her vitals. A hush settled over them as he studied the readings. His eyes flicked with confusion, then surprise. "Mira," he began slowly, "the readings. They suggest an elevated hormonal level consistent with pregnancy." Her mind reeled. "That's impossible." She snatched the scanner and peered at the data, but the readings were unmistakable, even to her untrained eye. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She thought back to all the time she had spent with Ralvek since they crashed. They had grown close, confiding in each other, but physically, a flurry of memories flashed through her mind. In the uncertain nights, in the shared warmth of the cave's darkness, two lonely souls had indeed found fleeting solace in each other's arms. The boundary that once separated them, human and Vashai, had blurred in a moment of vulnerability, a moment that now carried consequences neither had foreseen. She looked up, meeting Ralvek's troubled gaze. "Is this real?" she asked, voice nearly a whisper. "I believe so," he said, struggling for composure. "Our genetic codes differ greatly, yet cross-species fertility can sometimes occur under specific conditions. The deeper intricacies of xenobiology are not my field, but the scanner's data is clear." Mira's head swam. On Earth, the mere idea of such a pregnancy was the stuff of sensational headlines or hypothetical scientific curiosities. Yet here, on this desolate rock, it was reality. She felt a surge of panic mingled with awe. How could she possibly care for an unborn child, part human, part Vashai, in this hostile place? Tears stung her eyes, tears of confusion and fear. She turned away from Ralvek, pressing her palms against the cold stone wall. "This can't be happening. We're alone here. We can barely keep ourselves alive." He moved closer, his voice gentle. "Mira, we will find a way. I promise you." That night, the knowledge weighed heavily on them both. They spoke little, huddled around the faint glow of the portable heater. For the first time since the crash, Mira's composure cracked. Sobs racked her frame as she voiced all her pent-up fears about rescue, about the child, about her own capacity to endure. Ralvek offered comfort in the only way he knew, placing a hand on her back and stroking in slow circles, a Vashai gesture of solace. It was alien, yet strangely soothing. He murmured quietly in his own language, perhaps sharing a lullaby or a prayer. She did not ask for a translation. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them, and Mira drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of starships burning across alien skies. Yet amid the chaos of the dreamscape, she glimpsed a tiny figure with features both familiar and strange. The child's face glowed in the flickering starlight. She awoke with her heart pounding, uncertain whether the dream was an omen or a simple reflection of her troubled mind. The next morning, they confronted the reality. "We need to ensure you are healthy," Ralvek stated, voice calm but determined. "We cannot let fear paralyze us. The child's existence is a testament to survival, in a way." Mira nodded, swallowing against another wave of queasiness. She tried to stand tall. "We'll do it systematically. The med scan can help us monitor the pregnancy. We'll ration the nutrients so I get enough. And we'll keep the environment stable inside the cave." Though she strove for confidence, her heart still quaked. Ralvek's eyes flicked with determination. "I pledge to protect you both," he said, "whatever it takes." And thus began a new stage of their struggle. Every day, they checked Mira's vitals, adjusting her intake of water and rations to account for the child's needs. Ralvek ventured deeper into the cave system, determined to find the rumored thermal vents that might yield a better microclimate. With the ropes salvaged from the Eclipse, he descended into lower caverns. Mira's condition brought new challenges. She found her energy drained faster, and dizziness plagued her at inopportune times. Sometimes, as the planet's short day gave way to its abrupt night, she found herself unsettled by the knowledge that growing within her was an entirely new life, one that bridged two species separated by light years of genetic evolution. When Ralvek returned from his forays below, he often carried lumps of mineral-laden rock for analysis. He hoped to identify some form of nutrient that might supplement their dwindling rations. Early tests suggested trace elements of magnesium and iron that might be beneficial. The water condenser, though a godsend, only provided liquid. If they ran out of rations entirely, they would be forced to rely on uncertain sources of nutrition from the environment. Yet even in the shadow of these dire prospects, moments of tenderness surfaced. One evening, as they huddled by the heater, Ralvek softly placed a hand on Mira's abdomen. She tensed at first, an instinctive response to the strangeness of the situation, but she soon relaxed. "I can feel your body's warmth," he said quietly. In Vashai culture, the earliest stage of life is considered sacred. The child's first movements are believed to link past, present, and future generations. Mira swallowed, tears prickling again. "That's beautiful," she murmured. "On Earth, well, it's often a private matter, a moment for the parents to cherish." He met her gaze, the corners of his eyes crinkling with gentle warmth. Perhaps it is the same in every culture, in every corner of the galaxy. Their precarious existence continued, each day a test of endurance. Ralvek's leg improved enough for him to scout outside more thoroughly, searching for signs of rescue or signals in the sky. Although the communicator was mostly silent, once or twice they thought they heard faint static from a distant source. It gave them a glimmer of hope, though it remained intermittent and untraceable. Meanwhile, Mira's pregnancy advanced. The medscan showed steady growth, though the physiology diverged from standard human development. There were anomalies in the fetal structure, likely due to Vashai genetics. The child's heart rate was unusual, faster than typical humans, but in a range that seemed stable. Mira felt an odd fluttering sensation sometimes, as though an otherworldly presence stirred within her. As the child grew, so did the bond between Mira and Ralvek. Shared adversity had already forged mutual respect, but now a quiet tenderness filled the spaces between words. They spoke less of rescue and more of trust, of building a family, however improbable that sounded on a desert planet with no certain tomorrow. Sometimes, guilt gnawed at Mira. She thought of how the child would be fated to a harsh beginning if rescue never came. She thought, too, of her earthbound family, who might never know. A swirl of conflicting emotions tugged at her, but Ralvek's calm presence buoyed her spirits. One dusky afternoon, while Ralvek was out scouring the horizon for salvageable ship debris or signs of incoming rescue craft, Mira felt a jolt of pain in her lower abdomen. It was sharper than anything she had experienced thus far. Alarmed, she sat down and activated the medscan. Her pulse raced. The readings showed a temporary spike in what might be the alien hybrid fetus's stress levels. For an agonizing quarter of an hour, she worried that some internal complication might endanger the pregnancy or her own life. She breathed through it, recalling snippets of medical advice from an old friend, telling herself that stress would only worsen the situation. Gradually, the pain eased. When Ralvek returned, he found her pale and trembling. "Mira, what happened?" she explained in halting words, and he immediately ran a more detailed scan. Relief flooded him when the results showed that the fetus seemed stable, albeit with irregular readings typical of an interspecies pregnancy. "I can't lose this child," she whispered, tears staining the dust on her cheeks. "You will not," he promised, his voice unyielding. "We have come too far. We will endure this." Several more weeks crawled by. Their supply of rations dwindled dangerously low. Though they had carefully portioned each meal, the meager nutrients were no longer sufficient for Mira's growing body. Ralvek consumed even less himself, directing a larger share to her. She protested, but he insisted. When she was well enough, They made daily excursions to scour the rocky plains for anything that might resemble edible vegetation or life forms. The planet appeared barren, but occasionally they discovered small patches of lichen-like growth clinging to shadows of rock. The color was a dull gray, and the texture was spongy. Ralvek carefully tested samples with a portable chem analyzer. Some had trace toxins, but others were marginally safe. It was a risk, but they had no choice. They cooked the lichen over a small flame, hoping to neutralize any lingering toxins. The taste was bitter, almost metallic, but it provided some relief from their hunger. Meanwhile, the child continued to develop. Under the dim lighting of the lamp, Mira's belly was visibly larger. Her emotions vacillated between dread and wonder. In the quiet hours, Ralvek would kneel beside her and hum a soft melodic line, part lullaby, part meditation. She sensed an odd closeness forming, one that transcended mere survival. Despite the harshness of their circumstances, a certain awe began to blossom in Mira's heart. She realized, in a moment of introspection, that her child, this half-human, half-Vashai being, stood as a living symbol of hope. If new life could emerge here, on this forsaken planet, then perhaps rescue would come. Perhaps the universe was not so cruel as to deny them a future. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of scavenging, they sat at the cave mouth, watching the final glimmer of sunlight slip below the horizon. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple. Vedra Six's single moon hung low in the sky, a faint orb that reflected just enough light to see the outline of distant mountains. Mira turned to Ralvek. "We should think of a name," she said softly. He blinked, caught off guard. "A name? For the child?" "Yes, something that belongs to both of our cultures." He considered, his gaze drifting across the alien landscape. "In my language, the word for bridge is Shivani. It symbolizes connection, unity." Mira tested the word on her tongue. "Shivani. It's lovely, but maybe we find a way to combine it with something from Earth. My mother's name was Anna, meaning grace." And so they began to trade possibilities, forging new sounds and combinations. The exercise lifted their spirits, even if it was purely symbolic for the moment. It gave them a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. A turning point came on a blustery morning when the communicator beeped. It was a faint, static-laden signal, but undeniably more pronounced than before. Mira scrambled to boost the device's power with a jury-rigged battery. The wave of static transformed into partial words, a call sign she did not immediately recognize. "Crew of the Eclipse, if you are receiving, respond." Ralvek's eyes went wide. "It's a rescue vessel." Mira's heart pounded. She fumbled to press the transmit button. "This is Captain Mira Lang of the Eclipse. We read you. We're on Vedra 6. The ship is destroyed. We have 2 survivors." Static erupted, then a faint reply crackled through. "Coordinates. Send coordinates." Her hands shook as she entered the approximate coordinates gleaned from the data slate. She repeated them 3 times, praying the signal was strong enough. The response was garbled but carried the precious words, "Receiving en route. Hold tight." Mira's chest constricted with emotion, tears of relief threatening to spill. She turned to Ralvek, whose expression mirrored her own astonished joy. They had waited for so long. Now, there was an end in sight. The next 2 days were a frantic blend of optimism and anxiety. The signal repeated every 6 hours, each time clarifying a bit more. The rescue vessel, identified as the Celestia Voyager, was an exploration cruiser that had picked up their distress call after noticing an anomaly in the Eclipse's flight plan. Mira updated the rescuers on her condition, though she kept certain details private, for now. She merely stated there was a medical necessity for urgency. Ralvek and she packed what little belongings they had gathered, preparing for the potential trek to a landing site if the Celestia Voyager could not set down near the crash. With each passing moment, Mira felt the child move within her more distinctly. She was near the final stage of pregnancy, or something akin to it. The hybrid gestation seemed accelerated, possibly due to the Vashai physiology. Her body ached, but the prospect of rescue gave her renewed strength. At last, on the dawn of the 3rd day, they heard the unmistakable roar of engines across the sky. Ralvek used the binocular-like device from the ship's salvage to spot the approach. The Celestia Voyager descended in a swirl of dust, landing precariously near the battered remains of the Eclipse. Mira and Ralvek wasted no time. The day's first light guided them across the rocky terrain. Mira's ribs still throbbed with each step, and her pregnant belly made every movement awkward, but adrenaline fueled her. Ralvek supported her, his arm around her waist, crutch in his other hand. As they approached, the rescue vessel's landing ramp lowered, revealing a small party of uniformed figures, 2 humans, possibly a doctor and a pilot, and one tall alien from a species Mira did not recognize. They rushed forward, scanning the area with caution. Captain Lang called one of the humans, a woman with dark hair swept into a tight bun. Her tone was part relief, part disbelief. "Here," Mira answered, her voice breaking. "We have an injured Vashai with us," and she trailed off, uncertain how to explain the rest. The rescue team wasted no time, guiding them aboard. The interior of the Celestia Voyager felt luxurious by comparison to the cave's bare stone. Warmth, filtered air, and bright lighting swirled around them. Mira felt overwhelmed, her eyes stinging from the sudden onslaught of well-lit normalcy. The ship's doctor, a tall, soft-spoken man named Drevison, immediately led Mira to the infirmary. Ralvek followed, concern etched in every line of his face. In the sterile confines of the medical bay, Dr. Drevison conducted a thorough examination. His expression shifted from confusion to amazement as he realized the nature of her pregnancy. He took extra care, scanning and rescanning. "I've encountered cross-species pregnancies before, but never between a human and a Vashai," he marveled. "You must have endured a significant ordeal." Mira winced at the memory of those lonely weeks, but relief coursed through her veins now. She was safe, they both were, and medical science could step in where survival instinct had reigned. Within hours, the Celestia Voyager departed Vedra Six's surface, carefully maneuvering through the planet's thin atmosphere. From the window of her medical bay, Mira watched as the pale, dusty horizon sank away. She felt an odd pang of farewell for that forbidding planet. It had nearly killed her, but it had also witnessed the birth of an impossible bond. Once the ship established orbit, the rescue team contacted their superiors, relaying that 2 survivors had been found. They also indicated that medical support would be needed. Mira felt conflicting emotions swirl within her, relief that she and the child would receive proper care, yet anxiety over the unknown reaction from authorities. Ralvek refused to leave her side. He, too, underwent thorough medical checks, confirming that his fractured leg was healing well, though he had sustained other minor injuries that needed attention. The Vashai seldom displayed emotion openly, but the tension in his posture betrayed his concern. Dr. Drevison approached them with a measured smile. "Captain Lang, we're going to transfer you to a hospital facility on our nearest outpost. The cross-species pregnancy is stable, but we want to ensure no complications arise. Mr. Ralvek, you're free to accompany her, though we'll need to process you both through formal channels." Mira exchanged a glance with Ralvek and nodded. There was little choice in the matter. At least they would remain together. The next day, they docked at Outpost Theta 71, a floating station in orbit around a gas giant not far from Vedra 6. The station was a hub for scientific research and rescue operations. Within minutes of arrival, Mira was whisked to a specialized medical wing. Glaring white lights, antiseptic smells, rows of advanced equipment. It was an abrupt shift from the stone walls and flickering lamps of the cave. Ralvek lingered in the waiting area, talking quietly with station officials who wanted a debrief on the crash. Mira worried about him. He disliked crowds and bureaucratic procedures even more than most humans. But she was reassured by the knowledge that he was not alone now. They were in the heart of a well-equipped facility, surrounded by doctors and resources. In a private room, Dr. Drevison and a team of xenobiologists conducted a thorough assessment. They marveled at the viability of the fetus, taking note of the integrated DNA strands that apparently allowed the child to develop. Some recommended immediate advanced imaging, even invasive procedures. But Mira was adamant she would decide carefully, not wanting to risk the baby's health. Days blurred into a new routine. Mira remained on bed rest, though the environment could not have been more different from that on Vedra 6. She had proper meals now, carefully balanced nutrition designed for her pregnancy. She was no longer cold, no longer scrabbling in the dust. Instead, she had to navigate the questions of curious medical staff, the stares of passers-by who gossiped about the pregnant crash survivor. Ralvek spent long hours at her bedside when he was not fulfilling the outpost's demands for interviews. He, too, had to endure many questions about the Vashai perspective, the possibility of cross-species union, and whether it was a recognized phenomenon on his homeworld. Officials from Earth's Space Exploration Board eventually arrived to formalize the crash investigation. They approached Mira in her hospital room, offering condolences for the crew who had perished. They also expressed cautious fascination over her pregnancy. One official even hinted that there might be political ramifications. Some xenophobic voices in the government might object to a half-human, half-Vashai child. Others might see it as a symbol of unity between species. Mira felt exhausted by it all, wanting nothing more than to focus on the health of her child and the fragile bond she shared with Ralvek. The child's due date arrived sooner than projected by standard human gestational metrics. The medical team explained that Vashai biology might accelerate the process. What normally took 9 months in humans might take only 6 or 7 in this hybrid scenario. Mira's body was under immense strain, but she was in good health overall, thanks to the outpost's advanced care. On the morning she went into labor, fear and exhilaration mingled in her mind. Dr. Drevison and his colleagues took every precaution, preparing an operating suite that combined knowledge from both human and Vashai anatomy. Ralvek stood by, donned in sterile garments, his face reflecting a mixture of awe and worry. The labor was painful, more intense than Mira imagined, possibly due to the child's unusual physiology. Nurses monitored her vitals, administering medication for pain and sedation. Ralvek clasped her hand, and she clung to him as wave after wave of contractions racked her body. She barely registered the frantic flurry of activity around her as the medical staff scrambled to ensure a safe delivery. When at last the child was born, a hush fell over the operating suite. Through the haze of pain and medication, Mira heard a distinct, small cry, a thin wail that resonated with life. Tears spilled from her eyes. The newborn was a curious blend of features, smaller than a typical human newborn, with a faint lavender hue to the skin, ridges along the brow reminiscent of Vashai lineage. Yet the overall structure was undoubtedly human enough to be recognized as such. Tiny hands curled and uncurled, eyes squinting in the harsh lights. Dr. Drevison announced that the child was healthy, with no immediate complications. Ralvek let out a breath he had seemingly been holding for hours. For a moment, he and Mira locked eyes, sharing a profound sense of wonder. "It's a girl," one of the nurses said softly. Mira managed a trembling smile. "Shivani," she whispered, the name they had whispered in the darkness of a desert cave. A bridge, a symbol of hope. In the days that followed, the birth of the child sparked intense interest within Outpost Theta 71. Word spread quickly through the space lanes, reaching even the fringe colonies. Some lauded the event as a milestone in human-Vashai relations, while others condemned it as unnatural. Mira tried to shield herself from the politics, focusing instead on the fragile life in her arms. The baby's eyes were a deep violet, hinting at Ralvek's genetic influence. She had tufted wisps of black hair, human in texture, and she fussed if the lights were too bright. The pediatric specialists took round-the-clock notes, but Mira insisted on moments of privacy, forging a genuine bond free of clinical analysis. Ralvek was initially hesitant to hold the child, concerned he might harm her with his unfamiliar grasp. But once he did, an undeniable tenderness softened his features. During one quiet session, Mira and Ralvek found themselves alone in the medical bay. Outside the door, a guard posted by the Exploration Board ensured privacy. The hum of the station's life support systems droned in the background. Shivani cooed, her tiny fingers curling around Mira's thumb. "So small," Ralvek murmured, peering at the bundle in Mira's arms. "So fragile, yet so strong," Mira said, leaning her head on his shoulder. She survived the impossible. As mother and child rested, the formalities of investigation reached their conclusion. Officials informed Mira that the Eclipse's black box data had been recovered, revealing a catastrophic engine failure that caused the crash. No negligence was assigned to her. If anything, She was hailed for landing the ship with minimal casualties, given the dire circumstances. But the presence of the child introduced new complexities. Some xenobiologists demanded further research, wanting to isolate the baby's unique genetic factors. Mira refused any invasive procedures, determined to protect her daughter. With Ralvek at her side, she fought to assert her parental rights, even as certain bureaucrats pressed for the greater scientific good. In the end, a compromise was reached. Under the care of both human and Vashai medical advisors, Shivani would undergo periodic, non-invasive checkups. In exchange, Mira and Ralvek would receive support for raising her, including housing on a station or a planet of their choosing within Earth's sphere of influence. 2 months passed at the outpost. Shivani grew steadily, delighting the medical staff with her resilience. Mira gradually recovered from the physical ordeals, her bruised ribs and lingering pains subsiding. She found herself longing for open skies, for a sense of normalcy. Ralvek, too, felt caged by the station's clinical environment. Though he appreciated the advanced care, he missed the open spaces of his homeworld, and, paradoxically, even the simple daily struggles on Vedra 6. At least there, they had been free from watchful eyes. A delegation from the Vashai homeworld arrived one day, curious to meet the cross-species child. The Vashai ambassador was a tall, regal figure with an air of reserved courtesy. She spoke quietly with Ralvek, occasionally nodding in Shivani's direction. Mira sensed a complex swirl of acceptance and caution. The ambassador did not outright condemn them, but there was no joyous approval either. Still, progress was made. The ambassador assured Ralvek that, should he return to the Vashai realm, the child would not be ostracized. There would be challenges, certainly, but the Vashai culture prized knowledge and diversity. So long as no taboo was broken, acceptance might be found. At last, the day arrived when Mira was cleared to leave the outpost. She had been assigned a modest vessel for travel, courtesy of the Exploration Board, to reach Earth or any designated colony. Ralvek was given leave to accompany her. They planned to take Shivani to Earth first, so Mira's family could meet the grandchild, niece, or cousin they likely never imagined. Standing in the docking bay, with Shivani cradled in a sling across Mira's chest, they gazed upon the small starship that would bear them onward. It was far from luxurious, but it had the basics: life support, navigation, and enough range to reach Earth's nearest frontier station. From there, they could catch a commercial transport. A station official handed Mira a stack of documents. These outline your obligations: periodic checkups at accredited facilities and cooperation with medical research. You're free to do as you wish otherwise. She accepted them with a nod. After all they had endured, a few administrative conditions seemed a small price to pay. Before boarding, Mira paused to take one last look at Outpost Theta 71, its long corridors now filled with memories. She considered the improbable journey that had brought her here, captaining the Eclipse, the crash on Vedra 6, forging a bond with an alien navigator, and giving birth to a child who embodied the union of two worlds. Ralvek gently touched her shoulder, sensing her reflection. "Are you ready?" She drew a steadying breath. "Yes, let's take our daughter home." They stepped inside the vessel, strapping in for departure. Shivani stirred, letting out a soft cry. Ralvek soothed her with a gentle murmur in the Vashai tongue. Mira engaged the thrusters, and with a hum that resonated through the bulkheads, the ship lifted away from the outpost. Space unfolded before them in a tapestry of stars. Mira navigated the small ship along the trajectory recommended by the station's flight control. Once clear of the outpost, they engaged the faster-than-light drive, setting a course for the nearest Earth-aligned station. For a moment, drifting through the cosmic void, Mira recalled the first time she took the helm of a starship. Back then, she was a young cadet, brimming with ambition. She never would have guessed her path would lead here, with an alien partner and a newborn child carried from the harsh sands of Vedra 6. Shivani quieted, lulled by the vibration of the ship. Ralvek watched her with a gaze of awe. "She will see so many worlds," he murmured. Mira felt tears threaten again, tears of gratitude and hope. "Yes, she will. And we will ensure she grows up knowing she's loved, no matter what the galaxy thinks." The journey through hyperspace took several weeks. punctuated by stops at small refueling stations. At each port, they drew curious looks: a human woman, a tall Vashai man, and an infant with lavender-tinged skin. Yet aside from occasional gawkers, they encountered no overt hostility. Some travelers were intrigued, some kindly, others politely indifferent. Mira kept in touch with Outpost Theta 71's medical staff, sending periodic updates on Shivani's progress. Dr. Dravisin responded with encouragement, remarking that the child's development appeared to be on a normal pace for a human infant, with only minor variations in metabolic rates. In quiet moments, Mira would daydream about Earth, blue skies, green fields, her father's arms enfolding her in relief. She tried to imagine how he would react to Shivani. Would he embrace her as the grandchild he had never expected? Would the rest of her family rally around them? Or would they approach with hesitation? She had no guarantees. But after surviving a deadly crash and forging a life on a barren planet, she felt prepared for anything. At last, the final jump brought them into the Sol system. Mira gazed through the viewport at the brilliance of Earth's sun, so familiar and yet distant in memory. She transmitted her credentials, and the traffic control system guided them toward a stable orbit. A short while later, a smaller shuttle docked with them, carrying a liaison from Earth's orbital command. The liaison was polite, though Mira detected a flicker of surprise when she glimpsed Shivani. Nonetheless, the woman offered any assistance needed for the final leg of the journey. "It's best if you land near the capital's starport," the liaison said. "We can arrange ground transport if you have a particular destination in mind." "Thank you," Mira said, her voice tight with emotion. My family lives in a coastal region on the western continent. I would like to go there." Ralvek nodded, ever present at her side. Shivani cooed, as though sensing the significance of the moment. The descent to Earth's surface was far gentler than the crash on Vedra 6. The shuttle glided through azure skies streaked with wispy clouds, the sun's rays sparkling off the ocean below. Mira felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the coastline of her childhood. When they disembarked at a small regional starport, the warm air and the scent of salt water greeted her. She inhaled deeply, overwhelmed by nostalgia. Ralvek stood at her side, silent yet attentive, as though he sensed her emotional turbulence. They rented a ground vehicle and made their way along winding roads. Shivani dozed in a safety cradle, lulled by the gentle motion. Eventually, they arrived at a modest home perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. A quaint fence, a garden of vibrant flowers, the porch where Mira once played as a girl. Everything was as she remembered. Her father was waiting at the front steps, leaning on a cane these days. His hair was thinner and grayer, but his posture straightened when he saw the vehicle stop. Mira barely had time to open the door before he wrapped her in an embrace. Tears flowed freely. Her father's voice trembled as he repeated her name over and over. She had been officially listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The revelation that she was alive, that she had returned with a child of mixed heritage, was nearly too much for him to comprehend at first. Ralvek introduced himself with measured politeness, unsure how an Earth family would receive a Vashai. Mira's father seemed startled, but quickly mustered a gracious welcome. Upon seeing Shivani, however, he almost sank to his knees in awe. Carefully, gingerly, he held his granddaughter, a look of rapture on his lined face. They went inside. The house felt smaller than Mira remembered, but infinitely comforting. Photographs of her younger self adorned the walls. The smell of home-cooked stew wafted from the kitchen. Family heirlooms cluttered shelves, telling stories of long-dead ancestors. The conversation that followed was emotional, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and outpourings of love. Mira explained everything: how the Eclipse crashed, how Ralvek and she survived, how Shivani came to be. Her father listened without judgment, tears sometimes glinting in his eyes, sometimes laughter breaking through at the sheer improbability of it all. By the time evening fell, the house was filled with a quiet peace. Shivani slept in a makeshift crib, Ralvek dozed in a chair, and Mira stood by the window, gazing at the moonlit ocean. In that moment, as she listened to the gentle crash of waves, Mira felt the full weight of her journey. She remembered the barren horizon of Vedra 6, the bone-chilling nights in the cave, the despair that once felt insurmountable. Yet here she stood, her child safe in a warm home, her alien companion accepted under her father's roof. Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, of a fragile joy that only survivors understand. She turned away from the window and looked at the sleeping forms of her loved ones, Ralvek, who had journeyed across the galaxy with her, and Shivani, whose existence defied all odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The world might greet them with curiosity or suspicion. Governments and scientists might still clamor for studies and answers. But none of that could diminish the truth. They had survived, and they had found love amidst tragedy. Together, they would carve out a future that honored both human and Vashai heritage. In time, Shivani would grow to walk beneath Earth's blue sky and perhaps one day travel to the Vashai homeworld, bridging two cultures. And Mira Lang, once a lonely starship captain adrift on a desolate planet, now realized she was part of a story far greater than she had ever imagined. A story that ended not in despair, but in renewal. That night, as she nestled beside Ralvek and her child, listening to the ocean breeze outside, she closed her eyes on a peaceful world. Her last waking thought was a simple prayer of thanks to the memory of her lost crew, to the planet that had tested her limits, and to the delicate, beautiful life that now slumbered in her arms. She smiled through her tears, embracing the life she had fought so hard to protect. The end of one journey was the beginning of another, a future guided by love, resilience, and the quiet promise that even in the darkest places, hope can take root and bloom into something wondrous.